My name is Sonia Singh. I'm an organizer with the Workers' Action Centre. We're a worker-based centre in Toronto, and we are working on the front lines supporting workers who have faced workers' rights violations in the city. So we run a phone hotline, we do hundreds of workshops on workers' rights across the GTA. And I'm also here representing the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, which is a coalition of community, labor, and faith groups that are advocating for migrant workers' rights. So I'm particularly pleased to hear that the issue of migrant work is being discussed so much today. And so in both of those capacities, I'm here to very much support the recommendations that have been put forward earlier by other deputants, calling for a review of city-funded services, calling for full implementation of access without fear policies, and advocacy, as Mac just described, on the part of the city to provincial and federal government levels of government on these issues. And I want to tell you a little bit why with some examples. So through the work that we're doing at the Workers' Action Centre, we're seeing that residents in Toronto, it doesn't matter if they have status or not, are struggling. We know that work is changing. It is more and more difficult to make ends meet, and I'm sure that you're hearing about this from your constituents on a very regular basis. People are working in very precarious jobs in the city of Toronto. Part-time work, low-wage work, temporary jobs, and this is actually becoming the norm of what work is like. So we know that over a third of jobs in Ontario could be considered precarious jobs. And so as you've heard from other speakers today, when you add on to that reality that already exists for many residents of the city of Toronto, when you add on precarious immigration status, that makes working conditions, speaking out about violations of work, even more difficult. And I won't go into why, because you've heard from lots of speakers about all of the reasons. Our labor laws are supposed to cover all workers in the city of Toronto, but when even people who have full citizenship or maybe permanent residence fear getting fired if they speak up on the job, what does that mean for someone whose very work, like you heard from Wilson earlier today, is tied to that particular employer? What that means is in reality, those protections are just not applying to people. So I can think of multiple examples, and just to share a few from things that we hear when we're out in the community. Think of a restaurant worker who came to Toronto on a temporary work visa, and immediately when he landed at the airport, his passport was confiscated. He had already paid thousands of dollars in fees to get that job. He was sent directly to work, working long hours, a lot of overtime in very difficult conditions, living on his employer's premises, and advised that he could not talk to anybody outside of his workplace. So in a very isolated circumstance. When he was injured on the job, he was denied emergency health care by his employer. This is just one example of many that we hear about. We hear about people whose employers threaten that if they do speak up about unpaid overtime, about unsafe working conditions, that the police will be called immediately and that immigration will be called immediately. We know many times these are just threats, but they're threats that have an enormous power and keep people from seeking support or for speaking out on the job. I think about just a living caregiver who just last month, her employer terminated her and wanted to put her on a plane that day to go back home, something that is not in the employer's power to do. And when the police were called by the caregiver herself, the first call that the police made was to Canadian Border Services to check what was the situation. Putting that caregiver, she was doing nothing wrong, not necessarily at risk, but in another circumstance, that could have led to some very dire circumstances for the person. So for all of these reasons, we, as Mac said, we don't want to envision a city where people, the majority of people are living in fear, they're working in the shadows. We want to see a city where when people need to reach out for support, they can be confident, they can access that support, that there's a safe place, and there's no barriers to accessing critical services. So I want to specifically talk about how access to Ontario works is very critical. When someone is a migrant worker or in any other kind of situation and know that by quitting their job, they are going to have no income, they may not be eligible for employment insurance, they may have to wait for a new work permit, accessing Ontario Works is absolutely critical to have that confidence to speak out. So I am fully in support of the recommendation, as has been described by other deputants, around expanding access without fear policies, requiring that they be a condition of funding for city-funded services, but very specifically as well advocating that programs like Ontario Works, like housing, like healthcare, that are partially funded by the province, must be accessible to a broader range of people that are living and working in our city. I won't speak to the other recommendations as other people spoke to them, but thank you very much for this opportunity.